Hello there everyone, how you doing today? I hope you're all well. Today we're going into r/LetsNotMeet, where people could have been strangled in their situations they've been in. If you enjoy, remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment down below and hit that notification bell. Now, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? I was in a very bizarre robbery. Throwaway count because I don't know why. I just don't want this on my main one. Not much else a reason. So I'm a 29 male. This happened when I was 20 and it has led to some charming anxiety issues, which were actually only addressed about 6 months ago. I've been told the best way to cope with things is to confront the issues head on. And in a way, that's what I'm trying to accomplish here. So, before I got my life together, I used to work odd jobs around my hometown's neighboring towns. It was my way of avoiding college and going into the oil field. I made my money fixing fences, cleaning out horse stalls, and unloading feed and hay. Not actually bad work to be honest, but I'll admit that I used it as an excuse for not doing more with myself. When I knocked off of work, there was this little country-style gas station I used to go to because they never ID'd and it was easy to get a bottle of liquor or a six-pack and sold some of the best fried chicken that I've ever had to this day. Well, on this particular day, there was nobody at the register. It was a little after 5 in the afternoon and there was literally only one employee at this store, and it was a family-owned and operated place. I had plans with a girl that I was seeing, and I promised her a six-pack and a night of relaxation at her place while her parents weren't home. I was in a hurry because of this, so I went to inquire about why nobody was working. I went into the back room of the store where I found the owner, along with 4 other guys playing poker on a fold-out table. I said I needed to make a purchase, and he said he would be there in a minute. The owner, while a very good man, definitely had his share of addictions. At this time, he was high on something, which could have been a number of things. He told me to sit down and play a few hands. The owner was wearing a vest that had all of his money clipped into it. I told him I wasn't trying to lose any money, and he offered to float me the buy-in. I said I'd rather not, but 20-year-old me was always much easier to persuade. I'm not a good card player, but something in my family has always told me that I have more luck than I do sense, and within an hour of playing, I had made enough money to give the owner his entry fee back, and still had a lot of money left over. I'll put it this way. This wasn't an extremely high-stakes game of cards, but after playing the owner his fee, I was holding on close to $4,000. I'm not a gambler, and you'll learn why. So I'm not sure even to this day how the dynamics work. We were playing, talking crud, drinking beer, and smoking cigarettes. Just a good old time. And then the time became not so good. The beep from the front door rang into the back. I'm one for punctuality, at least when it comes to doing your job. So I was a little annoyed when the owner didn't tend to whoever was coming into the store, much like he didn't tend to me when I initially walked in. That's a random irk of mine. This pet still gives me the chills to think about. I could hear the clacking of steel-toed boots hitting the floor, which made its way towards the back room that we were in. It didn't seem like much, meaning that it wasn't completely out of the ordinary. Then the door of the room flew open and 4 guys entered the room. We were all wearing either red or blue bandanas over their faces. As far as their attire, they didn't look much different from anybody else. 2 wore cowboy hats, the other 2 wore trucker-style caps, and all 4 were holding shoulder-durable weapons. We were all ordered to our feet. Everybody complied. It took me longer than expected to register what was actually happening. The table was flipped over, and 5 of us, minus the owner, were forced against the wall at gunpoint. There was this guy on the door who apparently missed orientation because 2 of the guys in our party had slipped past him and he had to chase them down through the main store. The four of us that remained were held against the wall by a guy holding what I assumed to be an M16 assault rifle. The owner was taken, beaten, and one of the guys that I'm assuming, or I've always assumed to be the ringleader, took a buck knife and cut his clothing off. I honestly thought this was going somewhere else, but I guess thankfully it didn't. One of the guys started duct taping his ankles and his wrists. At the time I'm thinking, okay, they're just going to restrain us, take the money and leave. Not ideal, but that's manageable enough. And then they put what looked like a pillowcase or a sack over his head and sloppily started wrapping the duct tape around it. 20-year-old me wasn't having it. A bunch of punks with guns weren't gonna walk in and start messing with me or my company. Boy, was I stupid. I threw a nearby empty Heineken bottle at the owner's primary assailant and then progressed towards him. The bottle went nowhere near where I was aiming at, and I literally lifted one foot off the floor and didn't even put it down before I was struck and fell back to the wall. The guy that hit me screamed in my face. I don't even remember what he said. Still gives me a panic attack when I try to revisit it. The remainder of us were duct taped by our wrists and ankles as well. At one point, I had a barrel of a rifle in my face, and the guy next to me, God bless his soul, chastised the guy by saying, "You want to point that at somebody, then point it at me, not him." The next part screws with me in a variety of ways that I don't know how to explain. One of the masked men pointed the rifle at him, and then pulled the trigger. All that could be heard was a metallic click. I don't know about all of them, but the one who pulled the trigger definitely didn't have a loaded gun, which leads me to believe that the guns were just props. They took the money, shut the lights off, and left the store. The back room had no windows, so it was dark, like really dark. I kept a multi-tool in my pocket for work, but it wasn't one of the heavier grade ones. It was like a 2x2 inch one that could fit in my wallet, but I always kept it loose in my pocket during the day. It took some flexibility on my part to contort my restrained body enough to be able to get it out of my pocket, but I was eventually able to free myself. For whatever reason, I thought the owner was going to suffocate, so I went to him to free him first. He was fine, just in pain. Everybody made it out with nursing and trauma at most, no fatalities. The two that got away were found restrained in the same way in the walk-in freezer. Police were called, no investigation was conducted. I couldn't even drive myself home. I had to call my sister to come pick me up. I don't know about what was actually in store for us and what would have happened if we didn't comply. This is the source of many anxiety attacks, and the reason I'm partially afraid of the dark. I narrowly avoided being murdered. This is a story of someone I knew and had cut ties with because he was a psycho. The first half will be to add context as to why I cut him off, and the second half is what makes it a Let's Not Meet. I don't know if he uses Reddit, so I'll omit ages and locations. It started about 4 years ago when I was living in a friend's house while attending a nearby university. It was myself, my friend, his sister, and their parents. Roughly about 2 weeks into staying there, my friend's sister invited her boyfriend to live at the house too. And by all accounts, he was a pretty cool guy at first. Very sociable and full of great stories. We often sat around the table for drinks or talked about life, having a smoke in the garden. Within the first month, however, as he started to get comfortable, cracks started to show in his veneer. He would rant about government conspiracies, about how he was always a wronged party. He was big into Sigma male BS and martial arts, and Christ did he have a temper. He had this big dog he always kept in a cage that was extremely violent when he wasn't around. The dog attacked his girlfriend and had to be put down, and that's when the guilt trips towards her began and the ranting became incessant. About 2 months later, he had the bright idea to live in a shipping container, mainly because the parents wanted him out, and he dragged his girlfriend along for the ride. I'm not talking about one of those cheap little restoration jobs. This was a rented container in a storage yard among the outskirts of town we were living in. He would immediately threaten the staff there and constantly until they called the police. This, of course, was another conspiracy. He became increasingly abusive to his girlfriend to the point where the family got involved to get her out of there. I stuck close to them, having pretended to be on his side, until we could safely get her out. They broke up, which he blamed me for, claiming I was poisoning her against him to make her mine. She has a new partner now and they are happy. We all blocked the Psycho X on everything possible, but he continued to harass them until eventually he disappeared, or so we thought. Fast forward to last year, I started to receive messages over social media from several different accounts. I blocked each one in turn when I discovered who it was. Some friendly, some hostile. One of these profiles, however, was pretending to be someone I knew from university. We talked about life and how things were going. Eventually, I was invited to a house party, claiming it was a free house and plenty of people were coming. I booked time off of work, made my travel plans, and kept talking to this friend. Coming up the date of the party, I mentioned it to my friend, and she was interested in going herself, until I mentioned the address and she panicked. The address in question was property belonging to the Crazy X's father that was scheduled for sale. I waited until the day of the party and called the police to check the property, claiming a suspected break-in. They found 5 people there, including the ex. Parked out front was a butcher's van equipped for food storage and a collection of knives, hammers, and rope. Boy, am I glad I didn't go. Found out about this sub after posting in the Creepy Encounters and thought I would post here after being redirected by a mod. The story is called Could Have Been Strangled Today. Today I was enjoying the nice weather at my local park. They have 2 pretty small loops, one a little more covered by trees, and one that circles around a small pond. When I got there, only a few other people were here. I had my AirPods in one ear and was enjoying my music, singing to the open air. As I got closer to people, I would take my singing down to a lower volume, slightly louder than a whisper. While it is a public park, I was trying not to be too much of a nuisance to the other people there. People were smiling at me as I passed, and everyone seemed to be in a good mood. Well, I decided to go on the slightly more wooded, secluded path for my last lap before I go home. An older man passed with his dog, and we passed each other no problem. When I heard this weird, almost chirping sound, we are outside, so I assume maybe it's bugs, but it starts getting louder and less bug-sounding. I briefly look over my shoulder and realize it's an alarm or something and getting closer, because another guy is walking behind me. He goes to pass me and notice he has some weird plastic-looking rope in his hand, the kind they use around packages sometimes. It is the middle of the day and we're in a pretty public space where I didn't feel unsafe. That is until the guy, as he's passing me, looks at me dead in the eyes and says, "If that other guy wasn't here, I would have strangled you." Not really processing what he says, I got out a "really?" and he replies, "Yes." And he twists this rope around his hand. He continues walking and I got this deep chill down my spine as the reality sunk in of what this guy had told me. I texted my partner and he immediately called me and stayed on the phone with me until I got home. I truly believe I would have been in danger if no one else was around. Incidents like these make me scared of going out alone as a woman. John, the job center stalker. When I was 18 and newly graduated, I ran into some issues with my attempts to enroll in college, and also had a hard time finding a job in my area. In the meantime, which led me to having to sign up at the job center, they determined that I was too shy to succeed in interviews, and placed me in a group that was supposed to teach interview skills in order to fix that. The group ended up ultimately being a complete waste of time. I honestly think they put me in the wrong group or just needed an extra member and made an excuse to throw me in to make up the numbers, but that's not really relevant to the story. And the other group members didn't do much to help with my shyness, since they were all men who at least were 4 decades older than me, and obviously didn't share any of my interests. Unfortunately, I ended up gaining the attention of one member I wanted nothing to do with. I don't actually remember the man's name at this point, but I think it was something generic like John, so that's what I'll call him. John immediately got off on the wrong foot with the rest of the group when he interrupted the instructor during their introduction to the course to complain that him being there was useless since he would be retiring in a few years anyway, and no one wanted to hire someone who had spent over 10 years in prison. When that didn't get him the attention he wanted, I assumed the rest of the group thought he was just attention-seeking. The instructor had heard similar things before from people who weren't happy about being in the course. He waited until we had been given paperwork to complete, and then turned to the man next to him and loudly explained his prison sentence was for beating his ex-wife, but she was a lying female dog, and he never put a hand on her. She didn't even have any bruises on her at the trial, any evidence of bruises or other injuries before that either. But because she was a woman, the judge automatically believed her and sent him to jail. This immediately set me on edge. I'm not an expert when it comes to the law, but I do watch true crime channels on YouTube, and I've never heard of a sentence over 10 years for a single beating that supposedly never even happened and didn't leave visible injuries. Either John was lying and had severely beaten his wife to the point of putting her in the hospital, or he had been arrested on other charges and was covering up what he actually went to prison for. I immediately decided I wanted nothing to do with him, regardless of which one it was, and would avoid interacting with him as much as possible outside of polite hellos and passing him things if he asked. Like I said before, I didn't interact with other members of the group at all because of their ages. I attended the first half of the meeting in the morning, spent the dinner break in the library when the men all snuck off to the pubs, and then went home immediately after the second half was over. No one ever asked me how I spent my breaks, and since the pub and library were in opposite directions from each other, and couldn't be seen from the front of the building the group met in, because of the way the streets were arranged, there should have been no way for any of them to know where I had been. Which made what happened next even more worrying. About halfway through the course, there was a day where I had bumped into a friend on my dinner break, and decided to put off visiting the library until the course was over, for the day to catch up with them instead. When I did get around to it, I spent at least a quarter of an hour there before heading to the desk to check out my books, and ended up being drawn into a conversation by the librarian, who had noticed I was checking out books related to a franchise he also enjoyed, and that was getting a new movie next year. There were only a handful of other people in the library, so I didn't see anything wrong with talking to a friendly man around my age who shared my interests after 8 hours of boredom and paperwork. We had been talking for another quarter of an hour when he suddenly glanced over my shoulder, looked confused and concerned, and was just opening his mouth to say something when someone grabbed me by the shoulders. My friends and family know that I hate having my shoulders touched without warning, and would have never done that to me, so I immediately knew that whoever was touching me was a stranger, and knocked their hands away while turning around and backing up to the librarian's desk. It was John. He was standing directly behind me with a huge smile on his face, and as soon as I turned around, he made a joke about knowing he would find me here, and how I practically lived there before chattering at me as if we were friends. I was just completely confused. It was obvious he hadn't just coincidentally bumped into me from the way he was talking, but John had been kept behind while the group was heading out because he had filled out his paperwork incorrectly. And as I mentioned before, you can't see the library from the building, so he shouldn't have had any way of seeing me where I had gone. It also had been half an hour since I left the building, so if he had left not long after me and just seen me go while we were walking in the same direction, he would have come inside by then. The only way it made sense for him to know was to look for me there and joke that I practically lived there would be if he somehow learned I was going to the library during dinner breaks. Known I hadn't that day and guessed I would go after the meeting instead. What made that even stranger than that was that John had never showed any interest in me during the group sessions, and mostly ignored the way I ignored him unless we were forced to interact for whatever reason. So why was he now following me into other buildings to start conversations out of nowhere and acting like we were close? While John was still talking, the librarian leaned in to ask if I knew the man, because he had obviously seen my negative reaction to being touched by John, and while I briefly explained the situation to him, he asked John politely to please leave me alone or leave the building. John refused and tried to tell the man that we were friends, completely ignoring the fact that I just said we weren't, and how ridiculous it would be to claim an 18-year-old girl and a 50-something, 60-something-year-old man were friends in the first place. When the librarian asked again and outright told him that harassing other customers wasn't acceptable, and he would be removed from the building if he refused to leave me alone, John smiled and agreed to leave in a tone that you would use when humoring a child, before walking out and very obviously stationing himself right outside the door, waiting for me to leave too. The librarian was clearly concerned by this and asked for the full story of what was going on, and I told him, including my suspicions that John had been following me around without my knowledge, to know I would be there in the first place. He suggested I should stay in the library until his break so he could walk me to my bus stop and make sure John left me alone. But it would be several hours, and if I had waited, I wouldn't have gotten home in time to change and head to another meeting I had later that evening. So he asked me to at least come in next time I was there to let him know if I was safe, and reluctantly watched me leave. Johns immediately stepped into my personal space when I got outside, jokingly asked what the librarian's problem was, and still acting like we were friends. I tried to walk around him without answering him, and head to the bus station to go home, but he grabbed me by my arm and reminded me that there was a closer stop for our bus. When I told him that we aren't getting on the same bus because I had never seen him on the same one as me, he corrected me that we both needed the insert number bus, and told me where he lived, which was in fact on the same bus route as me. Although I was still tempted to walk away and go to the station instead, and possibly sneakily get on a different bus and just walk the rest of the walk home, it was very clear he was going to follow me if I did, because he still had a hold of my arm, refusing to let go when I tried to pull away, and there were several dark alleys on the way I had no intention of going anywhere near while in his company. When I agreed to go to the closer bus stop, he let go of me and started walking at my side, chattering like we were good friends again. John kept walking when we reached the stop, which was odd, but I was hoping that my lack of response to anything he said had made him give up and decide to leave me alone, that he had mixed up with the stop with one further along, and that I could run while his back was turned. No luck. As soon as he realized I wasn't following him anymore, John came back, frowning as if he was confused and asking me, "I thought we were going for coffee together." Shocked, I told him bluntly no. He kept pushing, trying to convince me that I had agreed to go with him, and when that didn't work, he switched tactics and claimed I had mentioned while leaving the classroom that I wanted some coffee. So he thought we could go together, and that was an obvious lie, too, since I don't drink coffee, and told him so. John's only answer was to say I didn't have to get coffee and kept pushing for me to go to a cafe with him. I firmly told him no, and apparently he took that as me not wanting to drink in public, because he attempted to invite me to his flat. If that wasn't weird enough, he started telling me that if there's a naked girl on the couch when we get there, not to worry, because that's his 18-year-old daughter. Because an 18-year-old definitely going to lounge around naked on her father's furniture in front of him, right? Other people at the stop were staring at us now, and I took the opportunity to point out that I was also 18, and firmly tell John that I don't want to go to his flat with him and to leave me alone. He completely ignored the last part and tried to claim I was lying about my age, and was at least 29, when most people at the time still mistook me for being in my early teens at first glance. The bus arrived at that moment, and I got on as quickly as possible, thinking I would be safe there and the driver would throw him off if need be. Nope. When I sat in an aisle seat to stop John sitting next to me, he physically shoved me across the seat, pinning me against the window to make sure I could not get past him unless he allowed it. The only way for me to get out would have involved me straddling his lap since the seats in front of us were occupied. I loudly told him to move and to leave me alone, but he ignored me and continued trying to convince me to come to his flat, although a few people gave me uncomfortable looks when I tried to make eye contact with the men in the hopes they would help. They would look away as if they hadn't noticed, or suddenly became very interested in their phones. I spent the ride huddled against the window, trying to touch him as little as possible, and was ignored again when I shouted at him to stop touching me because he kept putting his hand on my thigh, as high up as he could without directly groping me. No one did anything about it, but he stopped touching me after that. He had apparently also given up on convincing me to go to his flat that day, but when we were coming up to the apartment block, he pointed it out to me, physically turning in my face when I refused to look, told me his apartment number, and tried to give me a kiss goodbye on the cheek, which I dodged, before getting off the bus and knocking in the opposite window to try and get my attention, so he could wave at me. When the bus set off again, several people started loudly talking about how disgusting he was, and that men like him should be reported, while refusing to look in my direction, where I sat, shaking and seething in my seat. And other than an awkward, "Sir, so you were right?" from the driver just as I was about to step off the bus, no one bothered to check on me. As soon as I got home, I sent an email to the instructor, telling her that I wanted to switch groups and never see the man, explaining what he had done. She read it, but ignored me for an entire week until I sent a follow-up, threatening to get the police involved if they forced me to interact with the man again, and their solution was to tell me I could leave the course early instead, essentially kicking me out as if I was the problem. I bumped into the man not long afterwards, and he tried to ask me why I hadn't been attending the group anymore, admitting that he had asked the instructor and they had refused to tell him, but I managed to get away and lose him in the crowd. I've seen him a few times in passing in the years since, but fortunately he has never noticed me or approached me again, and I hope it stays that way. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and the stories that I told you. If you did, like and subscribe, leave a comment down below, and check out my playlists. I will see you all next time.